recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for holding this hearing. And Dr. Swagel, thanks for being here. Let's start with the good in this report. Despite the havoc the pandemic wreaked on our economy, the economy is fairly strong if you look at higher wages and lower unemployment rates. In San Diego, our unemployment rate sits at just 3.5%. Your testimony notes that the size of the labor force, which in early 2022 remained 1 million people below its pre-pandemic level, is expected to keep increasing, exceeding that level by the end of 2022. And what is driving the recovery in the labor force participation rate?
So it's a mix. It's got to be a large part of that is the reopening of the economy and scientific progress, progress with the virus. There's probably the strong, the tight labor market and rising wages are leading people to come back in. It could be high inflation in some senses is pushing people who need more income to come back in as well.
And I suppose over time that will serve to address some of the supply issues in the labor market that are driving inflation. Don't you agree with that?
That's right. And that's essentially part of why we have inflation moderating over the next couple of years.
Well, let's turn to some of the bad things in the report. You estimate inflation will remain elevated through 2022, and the Federal Reserve will hike interest rates to fight inflation. And I commend the Fed for doing that. But at the same time, we have to confront the consequences of rising rates. I'm serving currently as the Vice Chair of Policy for the New Democratic Coalition, and I helped start an inflation working group to identify solutions to ease inflation and ease the effects of inflation on families. I want to just note, you've mentioned immigration. You've mentioned tariffs. I also note that my colleagues on the other aisle, when they had the control of all three branches, lowered taxes for wealthy people in the middle of a booming economy. I'm happy to work with any of my colleagues on anything they want to do on any of those things, to get a fairer tax system, to cut back on the Trump tariffs, and to deal with immigration, which they've really left the building on. And I hear a lot of criticism, but I don't hear from the other side of the aisle is answers on what they'd like to do about this. Dr. Swagel, based on the Fed's current trajectory, do you predict inflation will slow in 2023 and 24, but spending on interest payments will grow each year for the next decade? Can you describe in a little bit more detail how interest payments will rise substantially over the next 10 years and how that compares to previous outlooks as a share of our total budget?
I can. So interest payments rise both with higher interest rates and with the increased debt. And the challenge is that the debt level has gone up by so much that even a pretty modest increase in interest rates will have an outsized effect. Now, it's not immediate because we're not funding the U.S. debt with like 30-day T-bills. So there's some time period over which those debt payments go up. We're at 1.6% of GDP for net interest outlays today. The 50-year average is like 2%. So we're actually below the 50-year average just because interest rates still remain moderate. And that's the challenge, that we're going up. We're going up to like 3.6% by the end of the 10-year window, both because the debt is going up, but also because interest rates are going up. And interest rates in our projection go up kind of moderately. So that's, in some senses, if interest rates go up even more, then the net interest payments, the challenge there would get even sharper.
I have a personal concern as a policy matter about continuing to spend more on interest than on the future of our children. Are there budget consequences for doing that?
Oh, absolutely. And the choice that you highlighted, that is the choice, right? And we are going to pay the interest payments on our debt, right? And that's since Alexander Hamilton. That's part of the country. But that crowds out other priorities, or it means that policymakers must put in place more revenue provisions. So it's rising interest rates and rising debt payments pose a challenge and a choice for policymakers.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate very much this hearing. I would just say to my colleagues on the other aisle, they all know that I'm interested in the deficit and working with them on the deficit. I'd invite them to work with us on immigration, on the Trump tariffs, and on a tax system that funds this government in a way that's good for our fiscal health as well as for our children. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia.